Hey guys, it's Adam from LUCIDPIXUL and welcome to the Painter's Hollow. Over the last few weeks and months, I've had the pleasure of indulging in some pretty fantastic conversations about the arts with some of my students. And there's one conversation I had in particular where we trailed off the topic of visual arts specifically and started to talk about art in general. All of the arts, dance, music, singing, comedy, writing, visual arts, you name it. Because both of us, like many of you I imagine, have indulged in a lot of different types of arts. The artistic mind likes to explore different forms of personal expression. I myself, for instance, have enjoyed playing music for many years, piano and guitar. I've been a dancer for many years, and my student was also a very talented visual artist, but also a piano player, a musician. So we had fun discussing and going off on a bit of a tangent about similarities in the learning curves in different arts. Even though these are different mediums, different artistic practices, different instruments, very often, a lot of the lessons that we learn, and one in particular, which I thought was really cool, it was towards the end of our conversation, we had a little bit of this aha moment. When we were talking about things we learned in art, and the things that can throw you off base artistically, mindsets or practices that you can indulge in as an artist that actually might not help with the type of art you're trying to learn. One good example would be in visual arts, be it design, concept art, illustration, fine art, whatever. Sometimes we don't realize that we're trying to communicate artistically in the wrong medium. Isn't that interesting? What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're a visual artist. You're a visual storyteller. You're an illustrator who likes to do book illustrations or trading cards or comic books. One of the things that come up very frequently during my mentorship as a teacher, when I'm teaching visual storytelling and composition, is you might be describing with your mouth or describing in words in the written form a very, very interesting narrative. But do the words that you are expressing translate visually? Or are they a form of communication that should be reserved for a writer or a narrator or an actor? Very often when critiquing and looking at the artwork of my students, I'll ask them to describe to me what it is that they're trying to communicate. What is the story? What are you illustrating? And for example, the artist might say something along the lines of, oh, well, there's this giant and he's trapped in a pit, kind of inspired by Dark Souls 3, because we both like Dark Souls games, right? And I go, yeah. And he goes, okay, well, there's a giant and he's trapped in a pit. And this wizard, there's this evil wizard who's kind of like Gul'dan from World of Warcraft. He likes to extract the life force from living creatures. And in this particular case, he's extracting the life force of a giant. Giants are known for being very sacred beings that are very spiritual and have a very strong energy. So he's created this pit to trap these giants and use them as almost like a life force pool, a resource. And I go, shit, this sounds like such a cool idea. I love it. That's a really, really cool idea. And he smiles. And I say, but not so fast. Because although your story sounds amazing, it's not translating visually. So I hear your story. I see a vague imprint of that story in your illustration, but I'm not getting all of that nuance. You're saying that this is a kind of a necromancer who extracts forces from from different living forces, and he's evil, and he fuels this colony. But all I'm seeing is the back of a wizard's cloak and some giant-like looking thing in a hole looking down at the ground. I'm not reading any of that evil. I'm not reading any of that backstory. I'm not reading any of that purpose. All I'm just seeing is a very simple image of somebody pointing a staff at somebody else. To which he goes, oh, okay, I see. I said, so what's important for you to realize is the core fundamental of what it is that we do as artists, as visual artists. We are, quote, visual communicators. And it's important to embrace that and be aware of that, because that can be a trap, unknowingly, that a lot of artists fall into when they work professionally, either by your own doing or by the doing of a less experienced art director or supervisor. So, pay attention when you're illustrating, when you're trying to tell a story as an illustrator. Am I using visual language or am I using narrative language? Does this story only have weight when it's spoken versus illustrated? And you have to be able to make that visual distinction. I can't stress enough how important it is to realize that, because in my career, I've had multiple experiences in my life where I worked with directors or clients that were great people and they were well-meaning, usually, but they didn't understand visual vocabulary. They didn't understand how to communicate a vision visually. So they would give me instructions, and because I lacked experience, I didn't realize that the instructions they gave me could not be illustrated, could not be done at all in the visual form. But because I didn't realize that that instruction wasn't conducive to an illustration, I took all that pressure on myself, and when I couldn't execute it, or when I really, really struggled with it, I thought it was my fault. And if I was working with a not particularly forgiving or kind director, they would blame me for that. There's an example I've used multiple times where one of my directors, artistic directors, so self-proclaimed artistic director, because he couldn't draw, but he didn't have any artistic skill, but he kept asking me to make these cartoon monkeys that I was illustrating more, quote, anatomical. And he kept going on about that for weeks. Make them more anatomical, make them more anatomical. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what the hell he wanted. I just thought, would you want me to make them like live anatomical models where I'm stripping off the flesh and making them super muscular and vascular? I don't know what the hell you want me to do. And that's exactly what ended up happening. Until a couple of weeks later, after really being at my wit's end with this, one of my colleagues turned around and said, I think he means volumetric. He doesn't know the difference between anatomical and volumetric. And as soon as I got that instruction, I decided to ignore what my director was saying. I went back to the original drawings. I made them more three-dimensional, less 2D, and problem solved. Or another client who I remember gave me what on the surface seemed like a very artistically interesting concept. But when you think about it objectively, could not be illustrated. It was somebody who wanted me to do a creature design, which is something that I do very frequently, something I'm very confident with. And I want you to imagine a creature, Lovecraftian by inspiration, that's larger than the universe and instills terror in the eyes of all it beholds. Very much in the vocabulary of Lovecraft. Which sounds really cool, doesn't it? Yeah, a Cthulhu creature or a Nyarlathotep or a Gug or something like that. And I sat there and I sat there and I sat there and I sat there trying to figure out how the hell to draw larger than the universe. It wouldn't make sense for me to draw, what am I going to draw, some large creature that's gripping onto the planet? Do I put a solar system next to him? That's not a scale that can be illustrated on a piece of paper on a surface. Furthermore, instilling fear into the mind of all who look upon it. Do I show this Earth-sized creature looking down at human beings who are looking terrified? How do I scale, like the scale of a human on the Earth versus, okay, so I guess I have to make this not the size of the Earth. Maybe I just make it like some Wrath of the Titans thing with a giant off in the background with some humans in the foreground looking terrified. So I went back to my boss and I said, do you mean this? Because I'm not sure how I can illustrate that. And he goes, no, it has to be larger than the universe. I went, but how do I draw that? And he went, that's a good question. And I went, yeah. So we worked it out together. And he said, okay, just make it this big, use a very dramatic perspective, have the humans in the foreground screaming towards the camera in terror, have some big monster with huge hands. We can do a scale comparison that way. Okay, good. Now we've got a visual translation. Now we've got something that's actionable in the visual form. See what I'm saying? It's interesting, when I was talking to my student, he made that same parallel with piano, because he plays piano. And he said, it's interesting you're saying that, Adam, because I remember my piano teacher talking about how your body starts to move when you play. If you're familiar with the famous composer and music instructor Benjamin Zander, who did a very famous TED Talk teaching people how to fall in love with classical music, one of my favorite TED Talks of all times. He calls it, quote, one buttock playing, that when you start to get into the flow, you start to lean onto one buttock. It's very funny. Well, I've had that feeling because I played piano a lot growing up, and I remember where I'd kind of close my eyes and I wouldn't even look at the keys anymore. I would just kind of get into this Zen state where I was playing, and I would just flow, and my body would start to sway back and forth to some strange undercurrent. I can't quite explain it. But he said his teacher would stop him sometimes and remind him that he's playing music. He's not dancing. And be conscious of the fact that his body might be feeling a lot, but his audience can't hear that. Are you playing with your hands, or are you playing with your butt? You're playing with your hands. So remember to channel that energy into your fingertips. Not to say that your body can't flow, but be aware of what your audience is experiencing at the other end. Same thing applies to dance. I could be dancing and I can feel the music in my core. It's in my head, and I'm feeling incredibly emotionally moved by this. I feel powerful. I feel heavy. I feel depressed. I feel threatened. Whatever it is that the dance was demanding of me, I could feel it in my bones, and I was emotionally engaged. But does my audience feel that movement in my body? Remember, the instrument is your body, not your mind. Actors, same principle. Same principle. Are you acting with your face, with your voice, with your hands, with your breath, with your weight, with your thoughts? Or are you acting emotionally in your head? And is that emotion, is that expression, is that identity translating outwardly in a way that the camera or the theater audience can experience? It's very common for actors to act in their head and not act with their body, with their face, the tools that they should be using to channel that energy. And be aware of that. While we're on the topic, I want to take a moment to talk about artistic growth and what the artistic growth pattern is like. And this is taken directly from yet another conversation I had with that same student this week. So it just goes to show what wonderful conversations we've had. He showed me some beautiful technical drawings he had done of skulls and lips and faces and proportions and rotations and things like that. And he stopped for a moment to ask me, because it was actually based off of an older assignment he had done with Proco years back, which just goes to show how fantastic Proco's class is, right? And they were beautiful drawings. And I asked him, first of all, do you plan on being a character designer or a portrait artist? To which he said, yeah, that is the direction that I see myself going. And I said, well, good. Then make sure whatever energy you invest towards your art growth, that it's something that pushes you in the direction you want your artistry to go. Marc Brunet would refer to this as just-in-case learning versus just-in-time. Just-in-time means doing it when you need it, which is what he was doing, which is great. Just-in-case means I'm just going to do 2 million studies because hopefully one day it's going to pay off, which is less efficient and generally leads to things like burnout, right? Because you just burn yourself out with too much exercise without seeing the reward at the end of it. So I said, you seem to be on the right track. To which he replies, that's great, but I have a follow-up question. That is, I feel very confident when I'm doing the technical drawing, but when I want to create my own stuff, this is where things start to fall apart for me. And I'm not sure whether I should keep doing this or focus on creating my own original work. And I thought that was a really good follow-up question because the answer is both. Artistic growth, artistic learning flips back and forth. Think of it as a tide that goes in and out. At the beginning, you're just purely expressive. You're just a person who's a nerd who loves to draw things that are cool. Cool. But then at a certain point you say, hey, I want to start learning technicalities because I want to start to become more, quote, professional. So you go to school and you focus mostly on very rigorous technical drawing, rotations, proportions, anatomy, foreshortening, camera angles, lighting, blah, 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 blah. And you keep doing it and you keep doing it. And for a while, it really fuels you. There's a lot of joy and a lot of reward for that because you're seeing your drawings improve. You're seeing yourself capable of drawing things you couldn't before. But then at a certain point, that resource starts to dry up. And you start feeling less and less stimulated by that. And that's usually a very good indication. It's a good clue. It might be worth you taking a moment to shift away from technical drawing and shift your focus more towards expressive drawing. How can I take these technical abilities and create something original, something expressive with it? Okay? Now, depending on the type of artist that you are, you might prioritize expressive versus technical more. A designer, for instance, leans heavily towards the technical, where a concept artist or illustrator, or fine artist for that matter, might lean to greater or lesser degree towards expressive as well, because it's a form of communication, not just a service that you're providing to somebody who needs a design, right? So if you're feeling that reward feeling is starting to dry up, perhaps it's time for you to start shifting your energy a little bit more towards the expressive. And it's going to be challenging, but you have to be able to balance the technical and the expressive together to create something that's not necessarily realistic, but believable. And that's fantasy, right? If you look at my drawing, it's not realistic. This isn't a real person, as you can probably tell. That's not a realistic costume, but it is believable. The lighting, the three-dimensional form, the anatomy, the textures, the reflectivity, the surfaces, the fabric, all of that kind of stuff, that does ring truer to realism. So you can see there's a combination of both. But then what happens? You get more and more expressive, you're having a lot of fun, but then you start to hit a plateau where you feel you want to express more, you want to get better, but you're hitting a brick wall. And you just keep rehashing the same mistakes over and over again, and that gets frustrating. So that's your body's way of saying it's time for the tide to wash back out again and get back into the technicalities. Go take a course, go learn a principle, tie up loose ends, become more efficient. And then once you feel more confident with that, let the tide wash back in and you start to express yourself more. As you gain experience artistically and you start to become more aware of what is demanded of you as a, quote, visual artist, and you understand visual language and visual principles more and more intuitively, the more it becomes muscle memory, the more it becomes intuition, and that technicality starts to wash away, and you start to become more and more of that expressive person, and you have more and more faith and trust in your technical abilities. And that is the ultimate goal of a visual artist, is you have such a strong fundamental core that it becomes a language like your mother tongue, and you can just express yourself in a very, very fluent way. And that is ultimately the goal that all artists thrive for, be it dancers or comedians or writers or actors or illustrators. It's the ability for us to just let go of the technicality and create art. And art is, by its very definition, self-expression. Sound good? With that said, I love you all with all my heart, and happy painting. Take care.